is here to look at the international papers. Actually, starting with that news that Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon planning to hold a second referendum here on Scottish independence.
Absolutely. So let's start with the Independent that's opted for the headline, just as you've dealt with one referendum crisis. A reference, of course, to Brexit. Centre-right, The Telegraph, meanwhile, is running with the headline, The New Battle for Britain. A battle between May's vision of a strong, united Britain outside the EU and, of course, Sturgeon's vision of an independent Scotland in the EU.
What about the Scottish press? I assume they may be mentioning this as well.
They are, yeah, you're not wrong. So the National, which is staunchly pro-Scottish independence, is sounding pretty jubilant today, unsurprisingly. It's opted, actually, that's not quite the right picture there, but if you were to see the real one, it's chosen a picture of Nicola Sturgeon looking pretty determined above the caption, Scot Ref, here we go. Now, on the other end of the political spectrum, we have the Scottish Daily Mail. The Daily Mail, of course, a vocal supporter of Brexit and an equally outspoken detractor of breaking up the EU. The Scottish National Party's Day of Betrayal reads their headline today. Sturgeon has launched a new bid to tear Scotland out of the UK just 907 days after the resounding no vote of the first referendum on Scottish independence, insists this paper.
So how's that being received then by the British government?
Well, according to this leading article in The Times, May is preparing to reject the First Minister's demand for an in-out vote within the next 2 years. The SNP needs Westminster approval to hold any legally binding vote. And this piece quotes May's allies, who say that there is quite simply no way that the Prime Minister will allow any such vote to happen while exit negotiations with the EU are ongoing. This piece also mentioning an early setback for Sturgeon. A number of EU leaders have said that Scotland would leave the EU along with the rest of the UK, even if it voted to break away from the rest of the UK. That's, of course, out of fear that any special treatment for Scotland could fuel separatism in the bloc.
And what about the British more left-wing press? What are they saying?
So, for The Guardian, any second referendum would be a crisis of May's making. We read here that May's apparent recklessness regarding continued UK membership of the single market and her readiness to leave the EU with or without a deal have played straight into the hands of the SNP. Let's not forget that Scots voted 62 to 38 to remain in the EU.
Now, there is, of course, another rather big piece of news out today from the UK that's been somewhat overshadowed, perhaps, by this Sturgeon referendum announcement.
Absolutely, and namely that Theresa May has been given the green light to trigger Article 50, the mechanism by which the UK will leave the EU. That's after peers in the House of Lords overwhelmingly dropped two major amendments to May's Article 50 bill, one of which would have safeguarded the rights of about 3 million EU nationals living in Britain, the other of which would have handed MPs a meaningful vote on the outcome of negotiations. So essentially, this should have been a victorious day for May, but Sturgeon somewhat stole her thunder. Nonetheless, a number of right-wing commentators are celebrating May's victory. Fraser Nelson, for The Spectator, writes that the Lords' amendments were never actually going to stop May in her tracks, but that the long parliamentary charade is what makes the British parliamentary system so democratic. It's an interesting read.
It's a different way of looking at it anyway. Now, though, The Guardian, they're not so convinced, are they?
Unsurprisingly. So this cartoon, you can see it there, says it all. A submarine manned by the government's chief Brexiteers descending into the depths with reckless abandon. The name of the vessel, you can see it there, Brexit Face, a rather lovely reference to Boaty McBoatface, an unmanned scientific submarine named by the great British public, which is set to embark on its first ever mission. You can see it there. The message, I think, of that last cartoon being that the name was ridiculous, but it stuck, and that Brexit is a disaster, but those in charge are ploughing on regardless.
I love it. Nice cartoon.